David Castagnetti and Brody Mullins welcome you to today's episode of Inside Influence. Today's guest is Jonathan Spalter, the CEO of the USTelecom Association. His association represents broadband and telecom providers as well as its key suppliers. Their goal is to provide policies and business conditions that promote investment, competition, and innovation. Today's guest, Jonathan, welcome to our show. Jonathan, before we get into the issues that your association is working on, tell us a little bit about Jonathan Spalter and how he's taken over this successful association in Washington, D.C.
Well, first, it's really great to be with you, Brody and David, and thank you so much for giving me and the broadband industry an opportunity. So, well, thanks for the question about me. I grew up in New York City, public high school, had a great experience there, doing things like being a vendor at Madison Square Garden. Always really.
What did you sell? What did you sell at Madison Square Garden?
I was able to sell popcorn, cotton candy, but we also all sort of signed up and said we were actually 18 so we could sell beer because that's where the money was. And if you want to know anything about the Rangers or the Knicks, I will be your guy. But look, I went off and really got interested in technology at an early stage. A journey that took me, right out of college to being actually a television reporter covering national security issues, international economics. That led to a decision to actually go and do public service. I was able to have roles in the national security community at the NSC, at the White House, the Pentagon, the U.S. Information Agency during the Clinton administration. And but at the outset of the internet, it was such an exciting time. I decided that once I left public service to really dive into the deep end. And so I pulled up stakes. Carrie, my wife and I, we moved to Europe, to Paris, and I started working in the internet world, helping to build and run internet companies that were based in Europe, serving a bunch of different markets. That's a journey that took me back to the United States, to California, continuing to be involved in building internet and other businesses, but never, ever losing a real interest in how policy really is the gatekeeper for how our innovation future can move forward. So I always had a link to the policy world. And through a number of different, just pure luck, I was able to have an opportunity to come back to Washington and help think through where the policy conversation needs to go in order to be able to foster even more technologies, innovations, and opportunities that this incredible phenomenon called the internet has been able to give us. And after 17 years outside of Washington, we got back about 8 years ago, and I've been at it since.
It's awesome.
As a reporter, tell me about your job with McNeil Lehrer. That sounded like it'd be an amazing experience.
It really was. And Brody, one of the reasons that I really enjoyed that role was I remember Jim Lehrer, the great Jim Lehrer, the anchor, told me when he hired me, he said, look, we are the news show that's going to dare to be boring. And that was a very, very different time. Really, praying at the altar of objectivity was the honorable way to actually think about what journalism could actually be. And the NewsHour, which was a real pioneer in thinking through how you can go do long and in-depth and analytical look at a bunch of different issues, gave me as a young person an enormous opportunity. Covered the Middle East, covered the Gulf War, covered the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Came to Washington, off of the Dukakis campaign in an old Chevy Chevette with my futon in the back. And really that was the launch of my real Washington career. It was just an extraordinary opportunity.
Yeah, I love how we all kind of end up in Washington and how we get here, and carrying our futons around with us is always fun. So tell us, Jonathan, a little bit about the U.S. Telecom Association. Who are your members? How do you come to consensus on issues that are important to the organization?
So the U.S. Telecom, I guess by definition, is the association that connects the connectors. We are the business league that creates a platform for all of those amazingly innovative companies, both large and very small, very local, often hyper local, that are in the business of trying to connect neighbors, businesses, communities to both the opportunities and the enormous innovations that come with uh, next generation broadband. And even though, in a sense, we're representing the newest, most powerful technologies that has really been existentially important to our ability to succeed as a society, we're actually the oldest trade association in the land, which is something that I learned after
Huh.
coming on board. We started literally in the 19th century as the Rural Independent Telephone Association, a bunch of small, plucky local companies in the heartland that bound together to try to take on the big telephone monopolists at the time and represent them and to give them an opportunity to succeed. And many of those small companies and their descendants are still core parts of the membership of our organization. Um, we represent companies as large and as successful as Verizon and AT&T, but we also have dozens and dozens and dozens of members that are literally locally based in small communities around the country. But we're all bound by a singular principle that we want to, as quickly, as nimbly, and as effectively as possible, connect communities to the power and promise of broadband that is so incredibly important to the fate and fortune, not only of our daily lives. We know that after we saw what the broadband opportunities gave us in the context of COVID, but also is the basis for which we are going to succeed in propelling our country to the next levels of competition and success in all of the other emerging technologies that are the hot buttons of the moment, from artificial intelligence to quantum computing to autonomous technologies that are allowing us to drive without drivers and all of these other types of things. Starts at the beating heart of broadband.
David, you mentioned individuals' sort of stories and how they got to Washington. I've told you, and you know that I'm from Washington D.C. But a little known part of my story that overlaps with Jonathan is that my next door neighbor growing up, or my neighbor across the street, was Roy Neal, who came up with Al Gore, and I used to babysit for his kids, and we're all still good friends. And in 19, I don't know if it was 1990, when I was in college, I don't know if it was 94, 95, probably 1994, I interned in the press office of Al Gore's vice president's office, which was super cool. I think with Lorraine Voles, I think was the head of the office
Huh?
back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I was 17, 8, however old you are then. But my first job was with a place called Communications Daily, Com Daily,
Of course.
which had nothing to do with Roy. But at that point, he went to a place that used to be called the U.S. Telephone Association, I think. And obviously that's where you are now. Can you tell us about the evolution from your industry being a telephone industry to now broadband tech and the future?
And by the way, the similarities there are incredible because even though we're overlapping in broadband now, Brody, I was in Al Gore's office in 95. We probably worked together back. There's a great short story by Flannery O'Connor, the great Southern American writer. Its title is Everything That Rises Must Converge. So, and you're right.
I probably got you your coffee back then at some point.
And I probably was too busy writing a speech that I didn't drink it. But look, that's a 1936 telephone. It's actually from Moldova, but that was the basis through which all of us communicated. And now think how far we've come. We have now the ability to not only conduct profound interaction, commerce, communication, medicine, education using broadband as a platform, but this has become, a computing platform that we personally own. And the phone element is just one of the hundreds of thousands of apps that actually inform it. But what's interesting is that even though, these kinds of devices, old telephones that my 14-year-old wouldn't even know what it was if you looked at it, uh, are still bound by many of the same rules that were actually architected in 1934 here in the United States with the first Communications Act. We have not really evolved much in terms of liberating the power of our innovation to unshackle itself from many of the mindsets and rules that guided the initial telephone. Our success as a country in propelling our innovation in things like broadband has been in spite of, not because often, of the innovation that goes on in government circles. And that's why organizations like US Telecom are so fundamentally important, to be able to create partnerships with our stakeholders in government to explain where these technologies can take us as a society, so that hopefully the rules, the regulations, the laws that help shape our future can have an even chance of keeping up with the pace of innovation. It's a
Yeah.
lot of hard work, but we're at it.
And Jonathan, just to play off that, like if you go back to the Telecom Act of 1996, right, where you guys were sitting in Gore's office and there was a piece of it, like, what do you think about today? Like, if you could take pieces of the Telecom Act, what would you rewrite to work in today's environment? What other issues is the association working on? And
Yeah.
how do you keep your members together and rowing the boat in the same direction?
It's a great question. It's a really great question, David, because for those of us who were present at the creation of the 96 Telecom Communications Act, which really did unleash unbelievable amounts of competition and innovation in our communication space, one of the things that was so important about the evolution of that act was that it was done fundamentally and profoundly on a bipartisan basis. And at the heart of that act was the notion that when it came to our most innovative technologies, which at the time was the internet, that government will operate best when it operates with humility and restraint. That government shouldn't think that its role is to be audacious and get in front of how these technologies and the platforms that we're going to propel them should be managed, but put the consumer and the innovators in the driver's seat. It's kind of interesting, for a massive bill that really did try to architect how communications of the future would proceed. The word internet in the 96 Act was only used 11 times. And in fact, Democrats, Senator Kerry, even there was very clear in the evolution of that act that when it came to things like the internet, government's approach had to be a light touch. And I believe at my core that that is a fundamental, practical, growth-oriented mindset that needs to continue to be a bipartisan one when it comes to America's innovation project. And here's where broadband comes in, and associations that are actually trying to support the evolution of broadband. Even though we have, I think, the most divided, and not only governments, but fissures that exist, in places like Congress. At the same time, there still are a few issues that do join us together in common cause. And COVID was proof positive that if we can't kick ourselves to make sure that we are enabling, not inhibiting, connectivity for everyone, regardless of what zip code that they're in, then we are doing a disservice not just to those individuals, many of whom still are unconnected, but to the fate and fortune of our nation to be able to compete globally and win in the new races of technology and the economy, and things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. And I mean, you name it, it's all built on a broadband basis. And so,
So,
go
sorry,
ahead. I'm sorry.
go ahead. So you had mentioned the Telecom Act of 1996. Around then also, I forget my timing. There's the Cable Act. Maybe that was 1990. The Communications Decency Act around that same time. That's just in the telecom space. There were so many major, seminal, landmark pieces of legislation during that time. And I feel like since then, as you were sort of mentioning, Congress sort of gone off the rails. They're much less partisan, they're much less bipartisan. There's so many fewer pieces of legislation going through Congress. Congress seems so dysfunctional. Are there big seminal pieces of legislation that the industry needs? And how do you
Yes.
get those done in the period of time when nothing's getting done and Republicans and Democrats aren't working with each other?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and here's the answer is that I mentioned that so much of our progress as a society, as a technology, broadband, are still being shackled by old rules, old mindsets. Starting with things like our approach to permitting, which is still bound up in the red tape that existed decades ago. Congress right now is looking hard at making sure that we can have common sense, practical solutions to enable basic things like shot clocks when it comes to actually getting broadband deployed on federal lands and state and locally. Um, and other opportunities we had that will compress the time it takes to actually connect communities and keep them connected. We have the ability right now of ensuring more security um, of our networks, cybersecurity, by enabling our companies to do basic things like share information without having to face enormous liabilities. By doing so, we're waiting on Congress to be able to ensure on the long term that we can do that kind of information sharing. We're looking to Congress to move forward on things like making sure that broadband programs, the public-private partnerships, programs like BEAD, Universal Service, and other programs that help ensure the longevity of broadband and connectivity, particularly in rural parts of America, can continue to thrive, but thrive in ways that are more efficient, not only for the taxpayers, but also for the end recipients, which are people in need of broadband. There's a lot that Congress can do, but there's also a lot that the administration itself can do. The administration can work very quickly through executive order or just administrative processes to make sure the government itself is better equipped to make the transition to modern IP-based, broadband-based networks. Think about this. I mentioned the rules of the 20th century. Well, those are still in place in mandating that many broadband providers, our internet providers, our communications companies, still have to maintain dated, old, expensive, and frail copper wired networks in parallel to their desire to invest and build next generation broadband networks. The amount of permissions, compliance, efforts that are required to discontinue copper service and make the migration to new modern IP is really, really challenging. Tomorrow, the FCC, the administration, can reset the rules to allow us to move in a more speedy way towards network modernization. We're really glad that we can work closely with a like-minded leadership at the FCC to make that transition. But we also need to work with state and local municipalities to ensure that we can do that as well. There's a lot of really great work that needs to get done. 26 is going to be an epical year. The 30th anniversary of the 96 Act gives us an opportunity to rethink how we can propel policy going forward for another 30 years. And it's going to start this year. I will never give up on the notion that Congress, well, within its wisdom and in its understanding of the critical importance of broadband to our future, will get around to making sure that these things can happen. But working closely with the administration, we can do that too. Think about this. AI. Well, everybody's chasing the AI soccer ball. We think it's going to be the most important, potentially the most profound evolution in our technology future since the evolution of broadband itself. But AI is nothing without broadband connectivity. We're investing hundreds of billions of dollars in our not only AI development, but in AI capacity through these hyperscaling data centers. And the conversation is, well, how do we make sure that these data centers can have the energy and the water that they require to be sustained? Because they're expensive and they have to stay cold. But remember this, without broadband, those AI data centers would be literally nothing but refrigerators. And what we're saying is broadband has to be brought into the conversation across all of our critical infrastructure, but also next generation innovation conversations, and be front and center when we're thinking about how do we enable all of what we want to propel forward for our economy and for our innovation society, because without broadband, we're going to get absolutely nowhere.
And Jonathan, just to play off that a little bit. So as we had the initial broadband conversations, we were very worried about kind of your bread and butter, the rural part of our country. We were very worried about delivering services to the urban areas of our country. The question I have now is, with AI, who are those groups that are going to be most affected by not being able to utilize those services as well?
So, you can map that directly to the communities in America without the access to high-speed fiber-based broadband are going to be left behind, are going to continue to be second-class digital citizens when it comes to our AI future. We want to make sure that every single community can have access to the best possible technologies, which also fiber is also the most cost-effective technologies, and not be left behind because either government policy or local decision making wants to provide them with um, not the gold standards of technology. So if we want our rural communities to have access to the kind of high bandwidth required AI uh, tools, and it's not just the large language models, but it's all of the other types of innovation that AI is going to be able to propel, and we got to get more broadband connectivity out there. I'd also say that it's not just the end users that could be left behind, but it's our entire AI project here in the country that could be left behind. Go look at China and take a look at the massive investments, not just that they're making in things like data centers, but in making sure that they have sufficient capacity for connectivity, fiber connectivity that extends from all the way in the eastern part of China to the west, and that have built networks to support and provide capacity now and in the future to ensure that those data centers will be able to thrive and produce the petabit levels of data throughput that's required. We in the United States have to not model ourselves on the Chinese approach, but at least make sure that we're not inhibiting the ability for all of the kind of infrastructure that's going to be needed for our AI future to get into the ground. And that starts with smarter approaches to building in the broadband requirements when we're thinking about what's the formula for ensuring our AI success in the future. It can't just be a conversation about investment or water or energy. It's got to include the critical invisible infrastructure that's called broadband.
It does seem like if you're looking at, it's so hard to get things done in Congress these days. It does seem like there is momentum for some sort of permitting reform bill, as you're saying. Um, but that's got to happen pretty fast now that we've got into an election year. Where do things stand on
Yeah.
on the committee side there?
Well, we are full ahead on trying to advance what's called the SPEED Act, which is a bill that's looking at bringing smarter, more practical, common sense solutions to permitting across the board from broadband and other parts of our nation's infrastructure that requires the ability to actually deploy and not wait around for folks to actually review things. Um, I just recently testified before a House committee, the Communications Committee, um, on permitting. They were 29 bills that they were considering to advance permitting. And I think that the distilled sort of headline there, and it's across the board, both D's and R's, understand that we need more green lights and less red tape when it comes to basic things like permitting. Um, but still, there's a lot of work ahead for Congress, including, in the next 3 weeks, making sure that they can fund the government. So though we're pushing like heck to actually move forward on some of these permitting bills, we can't, put all of our chips on that table. We've got to make sure that other constituents, other communities, other stakeholders that really do need these next generation technologies like broadband to be present for their communities can also join the conversation about the fundamental importance of permitting. And that's not just Republicans, it's Democrats as well. And the administration itself can help catalyze that conversation by having deeper conversations with Congress about why they think permitting reform is so important. Um,
And
we're hope
Jonathan,
we're
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
we're hopeful, but we have a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's the important piece of this, right? You're a lot of work ahead, to your point, as you think about 26, 27, 28. At some point, there will be some permitting reform that has to be done, right? Or at least we're hoping that there is. And you, in running the U.S. Telecom Association, is doing its homework in order to be ready for when that moment takes place. And I think that to me is an important piece of kind of why people in our industry do what we do, right? We have to be ready to seize that moment, whenever that may be.
Exactly right. And part of that getting ready is not just trying to move forward aggressively on practical legislation, but it's also the education piece that's important. You know, it used to be that permitting, many places still is kind of, it's like this ideological litmus test. If you're progressive, you have to be for slowing down permitting. If you're conservative, you have to be for speeding it up. I think that that's a formula that's a bit antiquated. I think if we want to actually have sort of an abundance agenda, a growth mindset, an ability to sort of have a practical perspective on how we move forward as a country in ways that are going to actually be in the public interest and lift up opportunity for all of our communities, we have to be able to have a smarter, more refreshed look at why things like permitting are important. The purpose is is not to lower standards. It's simply to make permitting processes more efficient and speedy. And I think if we can change those mindsets, especially if there are changes of administration in future elections, and if past is prologue, there always will be, then we're going to go a long way, I think, into being able to provide the kinds of citizen services and meet citizens' needs that are going to be required, not just for our communities, but in order to be able to compete globally in an environment where every single country in the world is thinking creatively now about how they can lead and move forward in technologies in ways that are going to outstrip the US capacity to do so.
David, do you have any other questions?
I'm good. I appreciate your time, Jonathan. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
I definitely look forward to that. And please say hi to my predecessor, Roy, for me.
I
David,
think Brody's got to go babysit now, right?
Babysit his kids now.
well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Really had a great time talking with you.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
Welcome back to Inside Influence with David Castagnetti and Brody Mullins. David, what do you think?
Yeah, it was really, I thought, interesting what we forget about in this world of technology that we've lived in. And Brody, as we think about our past guests, Malika Carr from Cohere, Linda Moore from TechNet, their job is just to kind of move stuff, right? Jonathan's job is to actually deliver it to people and make us all be able to use it more efficiently. And I kind of came away with this show with kind of three major thoughts. One is, according to him, it is the oldest trade association in town. Really interesting about the transformation that the organization has had from a rural telephone provider to what it is today, a key player in the tech debate. Second part is his words of connecting the connector. I love that, right? The ability to move that information amongst all of us so we can use it and kind of what is out there. And third, I think the most important piece for people in the public affairs communications space is he's doing his homework, right? He's testifying before Congress. He's working with the Federal Trade Commission. He's working with the administration. He's working with his own membership in order to kind of get ready for that moment when permitting reform happens and setting that foundation. People forget, right? Some things in Congress happen really quick. Sometimes things take a long time to get there, but he's doing the work. So when his issue hits it and is ready to go to the floor of Congress, they're ready to go. I don't know. Those were my kind of takeaways. What do you think, Brody?
Yeah, I was actually also thinking about our former guests, and one theme seems like that almost everyone is talking about is AI, electricity demand, and permitting reform. I think at least half our guests have sort of come around to permitting reform, and it seems sort of amazing that I guess this is sort of the age-old issue in Washington that industry just moves faster than government, and right now because most of the government is so dysfunctional and not working at all, it'd be such a shame if American innovation were to slow down or grind to a halt on the AI front where we're the leader if a silly thing like permitting reform can't get done. Everyone has more and more of a demand for electricity, or in this case, broadband. That requires, upgrading lines that are sometimes 100 years old. And this is something that should be 101 for Congress. But Republicans and Democrats have just forgotten how to work with each other, which obviously raises. I'm talking about a bigger issue for for our country and for society. But for our show about industry advocacy, it just is a real shows a real shift in how to advocate when most of what you do is go find your committee and subcommittee and start, working the process. And there is no process. You know?
Yep. There is no process, but I guess, and if we look at it from an optimistic perspective for a second, so at some point the process will work again, or there will be a new process created, right? And he has to be prepared for what that is. And I think the word he used, educate, we forget we are educators, right? In the public affairs space, where educators and salespeople, right, is the way I kind of think about the industry again as a whole, in this changing dynamic that we're living in, both technologically and politically, right? At the same time, both of them are very disruptive at this point.
Yeah. Well, yet another challenge that people are facing today. All right. Well, thanks for joining us on Inside Influence. And David, good to talk. And we'll catch you next time.
Catch you next time. See you, buddy.